Hey everyone, this is the designer, and today we're going to be talking all about dark mode. So why are we talking about dark mode? Well, it's trending. As you probably know, Apple has released its new macOS Big Sur update with a system-wide dark mode that looks like this. And this follows Google's lead with their new Material Dark theme. Now, I don't actually mind these default dark modes. But what I see designers doing when they build their own dark modes is where things start to go horribly wrong. So let's jump into the 6 things you should never do when designing your dark mode. Number 1, picking the right background tones. This is one of the biggest mistakes I see designers make when designing a dark mode. They usually pick a color like this or this or this. The problem with these colors is that they're too saturated. When designing a dark mode, you want to keep the background as neutral as possible so that text and other UI elements can pop. The same goes for choosing your background images. If you have a background image with bright and saturated colors, you should either invert the colors or choose a different image altogether. There's no magic number for how dark your backgrounds need to be, but I generally aim for something around 3 to 4% for really dark backgrounds and 10 to 15% for images. Okay, so now that we have a nice neutral background, the next step is to add some nice typography. But before we do that, I wanted to show you guys our newest course called Advanced UI Design. This course will teach you everything you need to know about advanced UI design principles, such as micro-interactions, visual, and interaction design patterns, and how to use advanced animation principles to improve the quality of your designs. We also cover a ton of advanced topics, such as designing for dark mode, which is exactly what this video is about. There's also courses on UI design fundamentals, visual design, and more. Alright, now let's get back to the video. The next thing you should never do is use white or gray for your text. Yes, I know that most systems like to use gray for their secondary text, but you shouldn't do this. Your main goal with your text is to ensure readability. Now, depending on the tone of your background, this might mean that you have to invert your text color to white. But generally speaking, you want to avoid any colors that are warm or saturated. Alright, the third thing you should never do is ignore contrast. So many designers forget that just because something looks good on their screen doesn't mean that it passes the contrast check. In fact, some popular websites such as Medium and GitHub don't even pass the contrast ratio check for their default dark mode. Now, if you're designing a website, I recommend using a tool like WebIM's Contrast Checker to check your contrast ratios. Or if you're designing an app, then you should check out this cool site called Dark Mode Colors, which lets you play around with different color combinations to find the right balance between style and accessibility. Okay, the fourth thing you should never do is add a toggle switch to turn dark mode on or off. Don't get me wrong, I love toggle switches, but a toggle switch implies that the user is changing an actual setting, whereas in most cases, the user is just switching between 2 different themes. So instead of a toggle switch, you should use a button or a link to switch between light and dark mode. So now that we've gone over the basics of designing a dark mode, let's look at a real-life example and see how we can improve it. Let's take a look at Facebook's Messenger app. The first thing that stands out to me is the background. The background is way too bright. If you open up the Messenger app late at night, you'll notice that your eyes will actually hurt looking at it. If Facebook would have used a darker background, this probably wouldn't have been an issue. The second thing I want to talk about is the buttons throughout the app. Messenger, they use white semi-transparent buttons for almost everything. The only time they use filled buttons is for their promoted posts. Now I get why they probably did this since their app is blue, but it still doesn't pass the contrast ratio check. Using filled buttons in dark mode is not bad practice as long as they're not saturated. Finally, let's take a look at their notifications panel. Here they have used a gradient for the notification bubbles. Now this is not necessarily a bad thing, but what they haven't done is added a border radius to the corners. If you look closely, you'll see that the corners are actually sharp, and this gives the illusion that they're a big white rectangle in the middle of your screen. Now this could potentially cause a seizure if someone is photosensitive. So now let's take a look at a website that gets it right. Let's take a look at Apple's new website for their latest MacBook Pro. Now, the first thing that I want to point out is the subtle gradient they use on the background. This gradient isn't just there for aesthetic purposes, but it's actually there to reduce glare from the screen. Another thing I really like about this page is the hero section. In the center, they have this nice blur effect, which makes the section stand out compared to the rest of the page. One thing I was really surprised by was their use of large call to action buttons. Okay, most companies will shy away from using big buttons in dark mode because they're afraid that they'll stick out too much. But Apple isn't afraid of that. I think it works really well here. Finally, let's take a look at their typography. Throughout the website, ULL noticed that they use a sans serif font for their body copy and a serif font for their headers. This is the exact opposite of what you would see in light mode, and I think it works really well here. So there you have it, 6 things you should never do when designing your dark mode. As you guys probably noticed, most of the tips in this video were pretty common sense, but it's surprising how many designers get it wrong when putting these tips together. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to let us know in the comments below. If you want to learn more about UI design, make sure to check out our full UI design course. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.